is going to start with Professor Peter Schönknecht, who is a professor of psychiatry and medical director, graduated from the Heidelberg University, and he studies in psychopathology and philosophy of science and forensic psychiatry. And his talk is about psychopathology and AI, how analytic German idealism may bridge the gap. Please welcome Peter, and that's it.
Thank you very much for introducing me, ladies and gentlemen. For the organizers, thanks for inviting to this beautiful conference, which until now already brought a lot of evidence on the very interesting field of phenomenological psychiatry, psychology, and artificial intelligence. I will add to this discussion a perspective which could be, you will decide this, a third way in the interaction between neuroscience or artificial intelligence and phenomenological psychology. You will decide about that. The title, Psychopathology, How Analytic German Idealism May Bridge the Gap, comes from a clinical background. So that is that if you see this beautiful drawing from the famous Prince ensemble at Heidelberg University, which tells you about the self-description of a patient saying religious delusion, religiöser Wahnsinn, may introduce us into the introspection of a field which is the source of many of clinical syndromes and diagnoses. We should never forget. Everybody knows that reliability of this perspective is low and that observation of behavior is a very objective field. My point to that is what we do, but we didn't formalize it. And maybe this is one idea of what I'm talking about is we observe also some different thing. We observe thinking. And this says we don't judge about the content, but we reflect logic, interruption, the function or the principle of how people think. And this will guide our diagnosis and is less formalized as it should be. Anyway, coming from that clinical perspective, we know from colleagues, for instance, Joseph Parner's group, also Louis Sass' group, and Zahavi, who told us now more than 10 years about that we have to rediscover the psychiatric object. Every psychiatrist, psychologist, psychotherapist will say, hey, what? This is our daily job. Why should we rediscover? Did we lost something? Yeah, we lost a description. This is convincing. And Parnas and others said in this content, in this in the paper, I can't emphasize that by the point of, we need a clearer, sophisticated, and philosophically informed debate about epistemological and ontological, philosophical terms, issues, together with an openness to other approaches, theoretically and methodologically. My idea or my work is based on this motivation, which with which I agreed a lot. What is that? A short roadmap for the research we do. What is that philosophically informed psychopathology research? It comprises 3 parts: clinical psychiatry and psychotherapy, theoretical philosophy and ethics, system neurobiology as term for neuroscience in general. Today, we are talking about the interaction between clinical psychiatry and theoretical philosophy. And now it comes back to what does it mean for philosophically informed psychopathological research? There are 3 parts today which are, from our point of view, important to this discussion. First is, in the room, it is very present, phenomenological. Psychopathology, for instance, Thomas Fuchs, I worked with him for many years at Heidelberg University, and many of you are in the field. Transcendental philosophy, which should be, if I'm right, sometimes forgotten even, we will talk about that. And analytical philosophy of German idealism, which is one of the focuses that now came up, for instance, at the Leipzig Institute of Philosophy, which are trying to combine and more than only to translate the German idealism into analytic philosophy. And I will tell you about that in the next minutes. We start with the so-called essentialist error. And this is a very nice clinically based starting point, because Nasser Ghaemi, you may know him, discussed in great detail what the notion of delusion introduced in the form we use it in the clinical context until these days by Karl Jaspers was motivated by. And Ghaemi discusses the concern and the conceptual framework of Jaspers' delusional criteria. And he very precisely told us that for Jaspers only the search for a single criterion of delusion was important. Ghaemi wrote, in more than a century thinking about delusion, one result is clear: there is no single essential criterion as Jaspers wanted to have it. And despite his genius, he says he was wrong. On the next slide, please. I can do this by myself. We go back to the three classic criteria Jaspers introduced already in 1913. This is conviction of something you think, incorrigibility, and then it can...
It's hidden.
It's hidden again. Okay, we go back. And this is the most important point for that. Exactly. Again, it is conviction of something, incorrigibility, and the impossibility derived of the content. Now, in the clinical praxis, conviction and incorrigibility are called formal criteria. And the third one is introduced as a question of content. And this is part of the problem. In my research, I'm questioning if the third criterion is a question of content, and I'm looking for a formal problem behind it. Jaspers didn't distinguish, and Ghaemi, as much as Walker in 1991, demonstrated that Jaspers was still on the way of an essentialist, and he wanted to have one criterion to distinguish delusion from non-delusion. Why I'm all telling you all about it? Because we are now living that, we are experiencing that it's not only about words. We are looking for something. We are looking for an idea to distinguish a clinical phenomenon. By the way, we should ask if AI at its present stage may be able to do that. I come back to that. And by the way, if you look to DSM-5, what is the criterion for delusion? So much of oversimplified that you can't stand it, false belief. It lies ages behind Jaspers, and we are criticizing Jaspers. We don't even try, or we don't even touch DSM-5, we don't even mention it. So much oversimplified is the situation in the field. So come back to the point Ghaemi and also Walker criticized on Jaspers. And what finally came Jaspers out with? He distinguished so-called primäre Wahnideen, so delusion, he said, from delusion-like. And only if the single criterion he developed, the ununderstandability is fulfilled, then you have real delusion. Ghaemi said, okay, let's take it as a fourth criterion. So we have the three and we have the fourth. Okay, let's go with that. For Jaspers, delusion is only delusion if you can't understand it. And maybe my clinical colleagues agree. Young junior doctors haven't seen much, seen one schizophrenic patient, and the next they tell you delusion. I can't tell you why, but it's delusion. I don't understand anything. Of the story the patient is telling you, he's speaking, and this it's not for disorder. So there's a problem. And the problem is also we don't even know where the problem is from the method. Is it in biology? Is it in the language? Can AI help us? And no, it can't if we can't. And so we have to do our work before. And I try a little bit to contribute to the situation. So this is just introduction. So this is just simulating ideas of my reflection of the problem in a book contribution. And now we come back to the points of this talk. The major point is still and again Manfred Spitzer, who in the late 80s took together what we know about delusion in this beautiful book, and he had a sabbatical in North America. And Manfred, also Bill knows him very well, went very strictly to what he found in the psychopathology as we know it, from a more strictly logical, analytically oriented argumentation pioneered by Spitzer. Then the concept of delusion only can be understood if it's based on the so-called transcendental philosophy introduced by Kant. And that means we have a problem of recognition. We have a philosophical problem. Maybe one day, I'm not yet at this point, clinical psychiatry, psychology goes back from this problem and says, okay, we can help people or we can't. But to tell you what delusion is, we need philosophers. We are not yet at this point. The paper is still open for discussion. Let you know what we know and what Spitzer stimulated and what I think about it. We come to the transcendental appearance. This is all about. Now we come to the speech of the 19th century, of the transcendental philosophy. Now, Bill could tell you more about what happened at this time. You had empirism, you had rationalism, you had Hume and Leibniz, and nothing together. And the one was an extreme over there, the other there. And Kant, in the Far East, you could say, why didn't he accept the chairs of Jena and others? He was teaching at the University of Königsberg at this time, but because he got the fresh prince from Hume from England first in Königsberg over the Baltic Sea. That's true. He didn't accept a chair because he would have a delay of several weeks being the first knowing about the recent publication from England. So, yeah, they are fighting. They are like you. They do what they want. And this is the situation. Now, some terms, notions, I try to introduce a little bit and then coming to the point. And I'm also citing experts and teachers in philosophy. I had a chance to get to know it. It is the so-called, if you want to read it, the chapter of the transcendental appearance and the task of the transcendental dialectic in the critique of pure reason. There you can find all that. The epistemological foundation of any assessment of reality is the topic over there. Baumgartner and philosopher takes it together. Generally speaking, the transcendental appearance arises from the fact that the subjective condition of thinking, especially of reasoning, which is the same, is considered to be the knowledge of the object itself. That's the point. Now you say, okay, that's just a reflection of the method. That's a more long-term, I think. Yes, that's it. But it happened in every speech you realize. Secondly, all the various fallacies of reason are based on the fundamental confusion between idea and object. And now it is complete. What I tell you now about this citation is, from my point of view, if you go to content of delusion, it's covered. There is nothing more. Delusion only can be, on the one hand, with reference to the unconditioned as soul, Kant wrote, with reference to the unconditioned as world, or with reference to the unconditioned as God. Soul or self, world, God. There isn't more. It covers the whole possibilities of delusion. And the principle is the same. It is a confusion between self and object. And now we come to the point that I want to add to the speakers before. Okay, we use language to think. No, we think in words. We use words to think. Can we jump over this problem to be self-limited by our thinking? We will see what happens. We have now a little bit the problem. According to that, we are close to define delusion differently. Delusion can be recognized against the background of a strict reference to Kant's transcendental philosophy as an erroneous reasoning in the knowledge of oneself or the knowledge of the world. Kant called this paralogism. Now you come up and say, was Kant a psychiatrist? I'm wondering that. There are some hints. There is a beautiful book, nobody mentioned that, by a philosopher, published 2009. There are some analysis about the motivation of Kant for his philosophy, and he touches some phenomenon which belong to psychology. Anyway, he hasn't any empirical evidence for that. This comes from the logic of his thinking. In the following, Kant's argumentation with regard to these fallacies concerning one's own self will be followed in my talk. In a sense, the argumentation of Kant's paralogism of pure reason as an argumentation strategy can be circumscribed as follows. It is impossible to infer from the subject of thought to the substance of a soul. Some of you may say this is metaphysics. It's a clear thinking of relations between these notions. Yeah, but then we have to know this and we have to use it. In other words, the empirically comprehensible I think, or other words, the unity of consciousness documented by it, is misunderstood as a symbol of a substantial object, which is then called the subject. And now you are at the point saying, does he tell us we are not subjects? We will see. Kant is very consequent. Because for him, it follows from that he calls that, this is a citation, that the doctrine of the soul based on pure reason in the sense of classical rational psychology is impossible. In other words, very hard words, psychology as a science is impossible. I don't tell that. I don't speak about that. This is too risky. And this is not my topic. 200 years later. Again, the transcendental appearance of reason itself is based on the fact that we consider subjective basis rules and maxims of our use of reason. Also that. It was differentiated at the beginning of this seminar. Not only the basic rules, also the use of reason, that we consider that to be an objective necessity for the determination of things in themselves. In other words, that we project our subjective reason onto objective objects. And now the notion comes up. That is an amphibolism. This ambiguity introduced by Kant is amphibolism. And this is, I tell you, also part of the little solution for this big problem. The amphibolism, that means the ambiguity of the terms of reflection, is decisive. Conclusion for that. Not yet finished my talk, but conclusion for that. According to that, the transcendental appearance, this misunderstanding, cannot be recognized in delusion. Okay, this is what you suppose. But now the point is, it also works in healthy thinking, according to Kant. So where's the difference? How can we be sure not to be in delusion? There's only a very, very small window. but it is useful as far as I want to judge about it. It is just about the emphasis on the amphibolism, the reflection on the ambiguity. And this is what you investigated in your task. The emphasis on the amphibolism of our concepts of reflection is a possibility, for, in my words, the only possibility given to non-delusionally altered thinking to encounter appearances. And in my words, to obtain a scope for action in a deceptive worldview. Because now it's all about action. That means if I'm deluded, I can't act free. It is about free action. And the only way to keep this is to have the capacity you can draw. It's not the knowledge, is it the capacity to be able to see the amphibolism. And again, now you say, this only comes after. And maybe yes. When I'm talking, then I have to be in the state I am. It always comes after. But then, even then, this is the point. If you go to the definition and criteria of delusion, it doesn't work on deluded people. They are uncorrigible, and they can't correct and are convinced. Maybe now the formal criteria of Jaspers have importance. I'm not saying, you see what we are talking about. We have the same problem, but different possibilities of resolving or dealing. This is the point I want to make. I have a look to the, you tell me, yeah?
5 minutes.
5 minutes maximum.
Yeah.
I want just now to open another window for the general aspect of the so-called analytic philosophy of German idealism, as philosophers, for instance, in Leipzig do. One of them is Sebastian Rödel. And I just want to give you an impression of how the discussion is. This is one who is trained in also German idealism, Kant and Hegel and Fichte, and but also together with the Philadelphia School, Robert Brender, who is collaborator of the Analytic Philosophy of German Idealism Center in Leipzig also. It comes to a point where they are so consequent that it's inspiring. With him, it's also about self-consciousness. And just to give you an impression how, and now it's important, this is a citation of his philosophy, but now it comes to the point to listen to his speech. So we should have the time for these 3 paragraphs. Rödel says, one may postulate a close connection. Now we have the Kant for the Kant thing. Now it comes to the explanation how further research could be and how it looks like. One may postulate a close connection and say, there's these two, that something is so, and that one thinks that it is so, are close together in consciousness. One is the foreground, the other is the background. One is the form, the other is the content. These metaphors, Rödel says, block the view of the crucial point in thinking that things are like this. I am aware that I think so. That means, that is, that I think it lies within what I think. Because I think that things are like that. The I think is inside the thought. The significance of this insight is fully grasped by us when we recognize that the self-consciousness of the experimental judgment, which is the absolute knowledge of the logical principle, is not an act different from the knowledge of which it is self-consciousness, which is the latter empirical knowledge of nature. Now this term comes into play. Absolute knowledge is therefore nothing other than the self-determining progress of the judgment of experience. Since absolute knowledge is nothing other than the ever-deepening understanding of nature and science, absolute knowledge is not an empty subjective form. It is the certainty of knowing that it is all reality. He brings it together undistinguishable in this speech. And now the point is, and this is the critique to the current adoption of analytic philosophy of this idea, it is about the speech. We can't translate Kant into analytic philosophy, as we can't phenomenological philosophy translate 100% into neuroscience or analytic speeches. We will lose the crucial content. This is a little bit the point this philosopher is fighting about on a very creative perspective. I will end now with, maybe you are waiting for that, we are talking about acting. And this is another philosopher of these days, Pirmin Stegler-Weithofer, an expert in analytic philosophy and so-called Hegelian. And now it's all about how we can resolve the problem introduced by my discussion of the delusion definition. And if you go back and with Stegler-Weithofer to Aristoteles and Hegel, you will find the solution in between the interaction of subjects. How does this speech go? Just to start in the middle, that all is about, if you listen here, again, about the selection of the real method, and where do we know which method is to apply to a phenomenon. And it is clear for them, and according to Hegel, the latest demonstrated that it can't found in the subject, but it cannot be deduced from biological observations. So if we want to investigate, we can't not derive or deduce the method from the phenomenon itself. Maybe now we come into a discussion with phenomenological approaches. Maybe this is then hopefully a creative interaction. On this point, philosophy did a lot. According to the Hegel perspective, it is the selection is based, and this as an emphasis or a hint also for further research, is based on a practice that includes dealing, and now listen, with uncertainty, incompleteness, or impermanence of the experience of the world. And again, we have the self-reflection. Maybe now phenomenological philosophy comes very close. And this is what Fuchs and Husserl before him opened in the gray zone, or the not knowing or only feeling. These are different notions of that. Here it is uncertainty, incompleteness, or impermanence of the experience of the world. In my opinion, this is a further building block that supports the preservation of the possibility of a sensible method selection, and so to say also to be sure in the distinction of delusional and non-delusional thinking. Thanks for your attention.